Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for the comments that were coming in throughout the recording. If you're finding that you are having a few difficulties, I've been experiencing the same with the chat box. As Hedy mentioned, don't forget you can also put your points into the Q&A and we can access them that way as well. But whilst we're waiting for you to put some questions into either chat or Q&A, and please remember, the real value of these sessions is not what we've just had, it's what happens now. It's that interaction, it's that learning from one another. But whilst we're waiting for you to think of some ideas and pop them through, Andre and I had a really nice discussion earlier in the week just to kind of get things moving. So Andre, if I can hand over to you for some of the things that struck you when you watched this video, and maybe that can also act as a sort of a stepping stone for our participants and our colleagues' questions.
Yes, that's brilliant. Thank you very much. Such a wonderful session. As I told a couple of friends of mine, probably yesterday or 2 days ago, I was so impressed. I actually took a lot of notes.
Okay, there is something wrong with your microphone. I don't know, you sound as if you were in space.
While Andre is just doing a few technical changes, one of the things that he was asking about comes back to the black box. And a question that he raised to me was looking at this analogy of farmers. So Ken Robinson made the point that really we should be focusing in the classroom not on a product, but we should be focusing on a process. In other words, that learning isn't just about what happens when you get the end result, you know, the test, but we should much more be taking care of our students as if they were crops that we that we care for and that we nurture, so that the process both leads to good crops, good learners, but also that it helps growth, it helps strength. Whilst we're waiting, Andre, hopefully to rejoin us in the next couple of minutes, perhaps if you'd like to raise your hands. I see Luminita, you've just raised your hand now. That's fantastic. We can pass the microphone over to you and, you know, share your thoughts or question with us, please. Over to you.
Hello.
Hi there.
Hello. I've been attending those webinars for a certain period of time, and while when it comes to assess, what really interests me is what is your opinion on project-based learning? While we speak about the product and we speak about the interaction of the student in the learning process, how can we assess it at the best level? I mean, the students' involvement in real, I don't know, in elaborating the project in which he and his peers are involved. So how can we do it to make the students more dedicated to what they are doing? Thank you.
I would be interested, Luminita, if we can take your question of how, and we perhaps just change that to who.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think in terms of project-based learning, obviously what you've got is a process which leads up to the unveiling or the performing of the project. Now, I think you were also asking a question about the use of rubrics early on. And I think what I would be suggesting, and I'd be very keen to bring Andre in here, he is the champion of project-based learning. But I think what you perhaps could consider is working with the students and involving them from the beginning in the design of the assessment itself. And this takes us straight on to teaching for understanding. The students, to an extent, set to their own assessment goals. And then if you can have kind of points in the sand throughout the life cycle of the project and encourage them to reflect, to offer self-assessment and peer assessment of the stages of the project. So, for example, if the final product is a spoken presentation, you might granularly think about, well, what language is necessary for that presentation? What language is necessary as part of the process? And then be assessing that along the way. In other words, you don't just assess the finished product, but you assess the steps taken, but you involve the students themselves in establishing the assessment goals that are both meaningful for you as the teacher and possibly for the school, but also for them. That would be my answer. Let's go over to Andre. I think your sound issues are now solved.
I hope it's okay now, is it? Yes.
It was great to have
I can tell. Yeah.
But over to you, Andre. What do you think?
Thank you very much, Neil. I was just trying to say that I had so much fun watching your session. I took a lot of notes. I talked to friends about it, the importance of discussing assessment. And now, especially with PBL, which is something that I'm really into. I've been working with PBL for a couple of years now. I just wanted to go back of providing the students with the conditions for them to thrive, like Sir Ken Robinson mentioned. And I just want you to explore a little bit more, Neil, if you can, the idea of a product versus procedure or process type mindset, right? Because I think this is the thing. When we work with PBL, what normally goes wrong, the way I see it, is that we are very much focused on the final product of the students, and then we have to grade that, right? And again, it becomes testing. So then you can use rubrics. You can, of course, use, it could be peer assessment as well, but still it becomes a numerical grade. And then you're not really focusing on the process of getting the students to be able to finally actually deliver something at the end of that period, which is really working together, establishing goals, negotiating. And I feel like this is probably the paradigm shift that we're looking for, right? So again, how do we work with that, right?
What I think is really interesting, I mean, a lot of people have, and it makes sound as if I'm diverging here, but there is a reason for this slight tangent. A lot of people have said, well, of course, we've moved online and it's not the same as being in the the face-to-face physical classroom. But the big exception to that was the development of speaking skills. And what we saw was, with the use of technology and the ability to record oneself or record as a group of people, that students really wanted to excel. So if we're thinking, and I touched on this a moment ago, if your product as part of your project is a spoken presentation and it's done online, or at least, even if you're back into the face-to-face classroom, you're embracing a blended approach, that in fact what you can achieve is excellence and much higher standards than we may have expected previously, where students are rehearsing, taking us straight into that overlap with TBL, task-based learning. So I think actually, how do we incorporate this into the process rather than the product? This, I think, is a fantastic opportunity for self and peer assessment. But think about it, actually, this is happening automatically. When a student records themselves using Flipgrid, if it's a video, or Audacity, if it's an audio, and then they're listening to themselves and they're thinking, what do I need to improve? They're automatically putting themselves into that self-assessment loop. You bring in their peers, who give them another layer, and what we then have is steps before the product, where the students are thinking about themselves. Now, okay, we're working with versions of, or if it was a written artifact, drafts of the finished product, but we're integrating self and peer assessment, metacognition as part of that pathway. And as you mentioned, if we then bring in some of the peripheral, and then I don't mean less important, but some of the indirect areas, and we bring them in as well. So you mentioned negotiating. it may well be that you set up a project in which the students are going to work on, I don't know, a student newspaper, but they have to negotiate the content of that newspaper.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you can then have mini stages of assessment looking at that area. But remember, the key here, I would argue, is that you're not assessing of learning. You're not saying, you know, you got 6 out of 10 on your use of functional language for negotiation. No, what you're doing is providing constructive, meaningful feedback, which then feeds into your own later input, either during the cycle or at the end of the cycle, preferably during. Let's just think about some of the phrases you were using for negotiation. What phrases did you use? Put them up on the board, put them up on the whiteboard, on Jamboard or whatever. What other ones can you think of? So quite a lengthy answer there, but I hope both Luminita for you and also for you, Andre, that gives you some ideas. Come on, Andre, you're the guru.
Definitely.
Here.
Well,
what added value would you add to that?
Definitely, and I like the fact that you mentioned, well, if you got a 6 out of 10, for example, which can happen for a lot of students at the same time. What does that tell you, really? Because you can get different answers wrong based on testing, and then you're feeling that, well, I passed the exam. Do you even talk about it afterwards, right? And this, I know you've worked as an examiner, as I have, and this is really the sensation that I have talking to students. If they got a certain grade, a numerical grade, that's all that matters to them, because they don't go back and look at the work they have done. And then sometimes they have very similar grades, but they have made very different mistakes, and then it never gets addressed. Right. So I wanted to hear from you now, Neil, especially if you think about the black box, right? Because you set your students on different learning curves, basically. You make it visible for them to see that the things that they got wrong or that were suboptimal, let's say, are different from the things that somebody else did. And then this is very important for them to reflect on their work and their journey as learners. So how is it that we can make this black box then something that is more visible, that they keep track of, instead of just, you know, adding input here and expecting output there and not really focusing on what goes on in the middle, right?
I love the fact that you're asking me this question, because of course I think the answer is in your area of expertise, but let me have a go to kind of give some idea of my understanding and perhaps what I would do. So what we're actually saying is that the teacher teaches X and hopes, expects, requires that the student outputs Y, which will be a version of X. But of course, what we don't know is what is going on in the individual heads of the learners and what's going on in the class. So this is where I think visible thinking and visible learning have their part, but particularly visible thinking. So in terms of involving the students with specific visible thinking routines, so that they, and I pause there, because of course the teacher wants to see it as well, but you know, this isn't a teacher-centric area we're dealing with. This is a learner-centered environment in which we want the students to be metacognitively aware of what they got. And then if they can, you know, so they might be drawing something. You've used previously the examples of infographics. They might do a brain dump. They may go through a series of simple, easy thinking, visible thinking routines, which enables them to go, hang on, I didn't really understand that bit. Or for the teacher to, or the peer to say, what you've got here and what I've got are slightly different. I wonder why.
Excellent,
so can I just pause here and say, Paola, we are aware that you've raised your hand. Thank you very much. We are going to come to you next. And then there's also a question about the use of L1. But can I bounce that back to you, Andre, because I look to you as the guru, the expert in these visible thinking routines. How do you feel that my answer and what you might say in a conference, be my buddy, be my peer, what
Yes.
how can you help me? So I've just done a verbal brain dump.
Yeah.
How does that compare with your verbal, with your...
I must say you are on track, okay, Neil? And I was just looking at Gabby's comment here in the chat box, and she talks about differentiation and setting your own goals. And I think this is very important because the first principle of mind-brain education, which is an area that I study, is that every human brain is as unique as a face, actually. And because of your background, because of nature, your genetics, for example, it's very difficult for you to anticipate how students are going to learn certain things. So they have to be aware of their own learning curves. And the only way you can do that, since we have biases, right? Everybody is biased, is if you get feedback not only from yourself as self-assessment, but also from your tutor and especially from your peers, I suppose. Because this is what is going to steer you in a certain direction so you can see how the things you are doing actually lead you to your learning goal. And I think that one of the things we can do really is to keep track of everything that we are doing. And I think that's what's missing in educational settings, is that we normally have a couple of tests that will happen now and again. And then we keep track of those numbers, the things that, you know, the grade that somebody gave us, but we don't really keep track of the process of getting to that stage and the things that we did to get there. And I feel like this is so important, even much more important than a numerical grade that tells you basically nothing. After a couple of months, let's say Neil took a test, I took a test, we both got 7, and then we just talk, we're having a chat, and then I say, Neil, remember we took that test? Yes. What was your grade? 7, just like mine. Does that mean we learned the same things, that we made the same mistakes? But we do remember only the number. The process is forgotten, and that's probably the biggest mistake in educational settings, EFL and general education everywhere. We have to keep track of how things are happening. That's what I feel. Yep.
That point about the individual learner, I mean, there's a lovely example of this, of the greatly respected and wonderful in his eccentricity, but extraordinary educator that is Mario Involucri, who was teaching a CAE class. And I believe it was a grammar point that he was working on. And at the end of the class, very interestingly, he asked the students to note down what was the most important thing that as individuals they had learned in that class. And one student wrote down the word wheelbarrow.
Yes.
Apparently nothing to do with the class at all. And the student said, well, no, I mean, actually, I was very comfortable with the grammar point, but it was great to see it reviewed. But for me, the most interesting thing was the word wheelbarrow, because I often wondered what that thing is called in English, that you wheel around your garden and you collect grass and leaves and you put in. So that's the thing I remember. You know, if that isn't differentiation in action, I don't know what is. I'm very aware that Paula has been very patient in waiting for us to come to her. So Paula, if you're willing,
please, Paula.
We'll give you the mic, and let's take the question from you, please.
Okay, I need to promote her to be a panelist because she has an older version of Zoom. So okay. Welcome to the panel.
Welcome to the panel, Paula.
Are you there with us, Paula?
I think so. I can see that she will be rejoining the webinar as a panelist.
Excellent.
Okay. Okay. Whilst we're waiting for Paula to join us, perhaps we can just have a think about the use of L1 and the use of L1 in reflection. So I'm just going to come back to the question that was raised in chat. Going back to your point on students reflecting on their L1 without the teachers reading them, how can this lead to changing the teaching? I understand it'll be useful for the students, but I wonder how teachers can adjust to the students' needs in that case. I mean, I think that's absolutely a really good point there, that if the teacher doesn't share the L1 of the learners, and I think in your case, it was an American teacher in Portuguese-speaking country, yes, the teacher can't share. However, is that always the point of reflection? Because let's not forget that assessment for learning and reflection are very close, they're very aligned and there is an overlap, but they're not the same thing. Assessment for learning makes visible the learning for the student and the teacher, and it creates a loop by which, perhaps we can call it feed forward, the teacher can change what he teaches next, taking into account the feedback that has been received. Whereas reflection, I think, is much more a personal thing. Now, in terms of how can it lead into teaching, well, I would perhaps problematize that and say, well, is teaching actually what it's all about, or is it all about learning? Because I think we're going to have a much more profound impact if we enable students to become effective reflectors on action rather than in action. In other words, after the event, they go away and they think about it. They reflect post activity. But as teachers, what we can then do in order to kind of make that not just, oh, I'm aware of this, I think about this, but you can then ask, you know, the series of questions, the 3 whys. So what, so what, no, sorry, I'm getting all confused here. So basically you start with what, and then you end up with what as a result. So you realize something. Now you think about so what. Well, why does that matter? Now what are you going to do is with that knowledge to change things? So that changes the mindset of the learner in a reflective cycle. But, you know, translanguaging is about using whatever language we have available to us. A stronger student, and I've seen stronger in terms of linguistic skills, can always mediate in L2 for the student who is struggling to articulate their problem for the teacher, and then you can then work with it that way. Paola, I think we're having trouble with her joining the panel, but I don't know, Paola, if you're able to write your question into either the Q&A or into chat, and then we can deal with it. You've been so patient.
She has.
In trying to get your question across. I'd love for us to be able to work with it.
Definitely. In the meantime, maybe we can ask Alina to ask her question because she's been waiting as well.
Yes.
Yes, great. Alina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you.
Hi, Alina.
I wrote my question in the question box, but I thought it will be a great opportunity to say it orally. It is about online testing and assessment. Here, I'm from Moldova, and here in Moldova, students are used to cheat, and it's very difficult to see the real progress. So maybe you have some advice in this regard, how to test them, or to assess even, to have the authentic results, not what thinks some other students, for example. And it's the case with beginners that is more difficult because they cannot write any essays or something creative that will show me that they know to use English, for example.
Can I just ask, Alina, if you can just tell us very briefly a little bit about the learners themselves, for example, their age, and the context in which they are learning?
Yeah, of course. I study English to law students. Okay. They are 18 years old, 20. Okay. Yeah, they are adults. Okay. Yeah, and they many of them are beginners. Yeah, so at the beginning I try to teach them basic elementary English, and then they have to learn some terms in law, for example, or in some other specialties. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Andre, do you want to go first, or?
Well, yeah, I was thinking here that maybe they're cheating because that the problem is on the assessment itself, if we think about it. I think one of the things, of course, they cannot write essays if they are at a very low level because, you know, they don't have language to write an essay. But I think maybe you can change how you assess them in a way that it will allow them possibly even to work together using L1 so that they can talk, they can communicate, they can express their views. And then maybe you can do something that has more to do with project-based learning or portfolios, or really looking at the evidence that they are learning long-term and not really focusing on numerical grades on a test that happens now and then. The problem is, and I realize that, and I think Neil can help here, sometimes we don't have an option, do we? Because of the institution we work at. So it's a top-down decision. We have to use that type of testing. But I don't see cheating as something bad in this case, because cheating is what we do every day, all the time. It's actually called collaboration. If you look at the workplace, it's not cheating, it's liaising, right? So maybe that's not the problem.
No, I totally agree, Andre. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head when you were making the point about making sure that if you have to do assessment of learning, and actually I'm going to rephrase that, when it's appropriate to do assessment of learning, because of course sometimes you need that institutionally, then the first thing to do is make sure that the assessment itself is fit for purpose. And if you've got students who are at an A1 level, frankly, expecting them to do anything other than simple sentences, and this is bound by what the CEFR suggests, is simply asking them to do something that will demotivate them because it's just too hard. So I think review how you are running assessment of learning activities so that they are aspirational but also achievable. But I think if I'm thinking about teaching a law course at a low level, probably what I would want to be thinking about is, well, what kind of language differentiates a law program from a general English program? So I would almost certainly want there to be lots of very high frequency vocabulary in there, because technical vocabulary and academic vocabulary on its own will not be enough. But I will want for the students to feel that they are learning something that is legal rather than general. And therefore, that will probably come out primarily in terms of the language, the vocabulary. So in terms of going back to what Andre said, I think a lovely approach is embracing collaboration. Get them to create flashcards collaboratively with the vocabulary they're working on. Get them, and then of course these flashcards can be used really nicely for spaced repetition and spaced learning as well. So you've got a double win. But also, if you start working with activities which both have the value of repeating learning, because we know that you have to remember, learn, forget, relearn a lexical item probably about 8 or 9 times before it really sticks. So you'll be having online board races, you'll be using Kahoot, you'll be using Socrates potentially. All of these assessment technologies, but which assess, or rather which enable learning through an assessment for learning process. If you need to have individual learning, then get students using perhaps Padlet to be creating something for public display, something they can be proud of. The other thing I'd mention is this issue of cheating. I totally agree with Andre. If we look at plagiarism, which is the #1 way in which students are considered to have cheated in universities in the UK, And very often and very unfairly, this is associated with students from the Far East who are venerating their sources. So they don't even see plagiarism as being wrong. They see it as a venerational respect act. Then I would actually open up the discussion with them. Ask them, why do you do this? You may not get an answer, but you may, but also make them aware of your expectations of them. What's accepted and what isn't. Maybe a learning contract might help to actually set the ground rules at the beginning of the program. But I'd say review your assessment activities, try and make everything as repetitious as possible without becoming boring, and explain to them why you're doing it. And then hand over the students to work collaboratively. Because if they're cheating, the chances are, unless they're copying from something, that actually they want to work together. So why not embrace it? I hope, Alina, that gives you some food for thought.
Yeah, thank you a lot.
My pleasure.
Definitely.
Our pleasure. Right, if we go to chat, I'm not sure if there's anything.
Yeah, there's a very nice comment here, Neil, by Carolina, and she talks about really using L1. And again, I think this is such an important topic, because I feel like we discussed a couple of weeks ago, last week when I was doing my session, I feel like we've had stigmatized the use of L1 in the classroom, right? Yeah. And I wanted you to comment on that. There are certain tasks that will require students to use L1 more often because maybe they don't have the level to work with that. And do you assign a certain period of your lesson, maybe a couple of minutes, for them to use that, or it just happens more spontaneously? Is there any sort of procedure that you follow, or you don't really have anything fixed? It just happens as it goes?
I think it depends on who I'm teaching. So, for example, I was recently involved in a teacher development course. This was a partnership between TEFL, the British Council, and English UK, and we developed a teacher development program for a group of teachers working in Cameroon. And we had them for 3 months. And I was absolutely clear that I wanted this course to be sustainable in terms of, it wasn't just a 3-month intervention, then, you know, knowledgeable white man goes again and everyone's left. I mean, that was just such an imperialistic post-colonial view that was entirely inappropriate. Rather, what I was looking for is to have the participants developing a mindset and a growth mindset which would enable what they were learning in the course to continue after the course. Now, I should also add that the language level of these teachers varied from A2 to good B2. So I actually decided that the reflective track of this program was going to be optional in terms of the language that was used. Completely French, completely English, or code switching. Because these were actually bilingual teachers working, because most teachers in Cameroon are bilingual teachers of French and English. If I was working in a multilingual class here in the UK, because the majority of our students on our classes are multilingual, then that perhaps presents more of a challenge, or apparently a challenge, than if I was teaching like many of the colleagues who are joining us today, who are working overseas in largely monolingual classrooms, where I think the strategic use of L1, so, you know, mediation activities, instruct in English, repeat in the mother tongue, instruct in English and ask one of the students to re-instruct in the mother tongue. Yeah. Do your concept checking questions sometimes in English, sometimes in L1. Now, at the moment, I'm teaching online all the teaching that I'm doing at the moment is teacher development and ESP, medical English. And I'll be honest, I'm doing very little L1 work, because it doesn't really, I can't find a way to make it enhance learning. And that's my point about translanguaging. It's natural, it's inevitable.
Yeah.
But for the teacher to bring it into the classroom where it may still be stigmatized, I think a great way to begin is have a clear rationale for why you're doing what you're doing, and make the students aware of that, and potentially make your peer group, other teachers, your head of department aware as well. Quite a long answer to what may have been just here are 3 quick tips, but that's my approach. How does that link in with what both people in the who are tuning in today, plus also you, Andre? How does that fit in with your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you were on the spot there, Neil, because I work in bilingual contexts, and in many situations, there wouldn't be any work if there was no translanguaging, no code switching, for example, because they simply cannot produce at that level in L2. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And I feel like this is something that has been gradually changing nowadays with the notion of English as a lingua franca, for example, bilingual schools, or schools that are international schools, and a CLIL and all of that. And then, since we're coming to the end of this discussion, I want you to answer one of the big questions now. So this is one of the big questions, because I feel like the message behind your session is really that we want students to become lifelong learners.
Yeah.
They have to be more metacognitive and be aware of how they can learn best through reflection and through experimenting, basically, and keeping track of the things that they do. And then, of course, there is a climb, you said. It's assessment as a climb. So it's more teacher-centered, more teacher-regulated, and then it moves on to more student-regulated. And we want them to be self-efficacious, self-regulated, and to own their own learning process, right? So based on all of those things, how do you think this will change learning? How does that impact learning overall? Because I have experienced that. I know you have. Does it really impact learning in a positive way?
I think your question itself answers itself, because very interestingly, you've asked a question about learning, where I think 20 years ago, people would have looked at you and said, well, even 5-10 years ago, why is he talking about learning? Why is he not talking about teaching?
Not teaching.
And I think that's the discourse change. I think it's the framework change. I think it's the key to all of this. I did a course called TEFL, Certificate in Teaching of English as a Foreign Language. I then did a diploma, diploma in English language teaching to adults. And I think we need to really rethink the primacy of the T and replace it with the primacy of the L. So hopefully one day we'll be working in contexts where there is a kind of an accumulative effect, that every teacher is on board with an evidence-based approach to the classroom, in which we are collaboratively looking at ways in which we can enhance the learning environment to allow our students, when they step out of the confines, the 4 walls of the classroom, and continue to learn, and to continue to enjoy learning. But surely those are the baselines, the foundations of lifelong learning. So I think if we're thinking about teaching, we're thinking about validating our role, because our students get numbers like 8, 9, and 10 out of 10. If we're thinking about learning, we're taking our students on a pathway where they are self-regulating, and they are themselves the primary agents for getting that 10 and the joy all the way through. So the 10 almost becomes secondary. There will have to be a 10 as they leave school and they move on to university. There'll be a 10 when they leave university. But even there, that 10 can be achieved using assessment techniques and assessment types that are much more interesting than the traditional essay. But for me, everything aims at that one big idea, which is learning.
Excellent. I think I couldn't have said better myself. And I'm looking at the chat box here, and Gabi says that she's been advocating for this half of her life, and she's really happy that we're discussing it. So we are all on the same page, aren't we? And and I think we don't have any time left. I just wanted to thank you, Neil, for such a brilliant and very thought-provoking session, because really, it's time, it's actually high time we restarted what we've been doing for a couple of decades now, because it's not so much about teaching, it's really about learning. And we have to empower our students with this, well, everything that leads them to better learning, and they have to reflect on how to get there. So thank you very much, Neil. It was really a truly amazing session, and I hope that everybody got something out of it. I'm sure they did. Do you have any final words, Neil? Some comments, suggestions?
As we were joking as this session was beginning about the soft toys that we all seem to have. And I'm just going to introduce you. This is my friend Nifty the rabbit. And I do that because you may think, well, what? I think learning and the classroom is playful. And I think collaboration is key. So what I would like to suggest is the success of this afternoon was not to do with anything about what any one individual did. We've learned from one another. I've learned massively from having the pleasure of collaborating with you on a number of sessions now, and I hope we can do many more. So I'd like to actually say, as yeah, I do know a bit about assessment, let's be honest, but also I'm so excited to be learning from you about evidence-based teaching, scientific approaches to learning, and spaced repetition. So I'm going to plug you now, and I'm also going to plug Anna Kucha, because what I'm seeing in Gallery Teachers masterclasses at the moment is this extraordinary movement away from the the EFL safe subjects that we all see on preliminary training, towards a much more exciting and a much more embracing vision of ELT as something that is truly transformative. So, Andre, thank you for your part in that. Thank you to Gallery Teachers for being so brave in what they are doing. And my goodness, it's a pleasure to be involved. I know we're lucky enough to have the CEO with us today, plus, of course, Gabi, Hedy, and all of the team. Janice was with us earlier. So let's enjoy the journey. I'm learning so much from this. Thank you, everyone.